Welcome. In this video, I'm going to show you how I turned a $20 microcontroller into a professional synthesizer. We're also going to see how the YouTube algorithm likes 30-minute PowerPoints. And if you're Dave's mom, an especially warm welcome. So if you're interested in music, signal processing, math, software, or embedded, you are in the right place. I'm going to introduce you to the concept of what I did here, talk through the hardware, talk through the theory of audio synthesis, some practical tips for how to implement it in software, and I'll tell you about what I'm doing next. So here's what motivated me to work on this project. Say you have a keyboard that has no built-in sounds, or you want to expand the sound options. So you could buy pretty affordable MIDI controllers that don't have built-in sounds, or maybe you're just not satisfied with what you hear on board. So you can take digital data out of these controllers, and that's called MIDI data, and that just means that's just data that says like the user pressed C with 75% force, data like that. And then you can plug that into say a computer, that's very common. This would be running a digital audio workstation like GarageBand, Logic, or Ableton. And then to get sound out of your computer, usually you would have to go to an audio interface and then to speakers. And so this works, but it's kind of a pain. Also, computers can't guarantee low latency between the input here and the audio output. And playing piano with a delayed um, audio lag, it's torture. So I don't love doing this, and especially in a gigging environment, dragging a laptop and an audio interface to the gig, it would be a little bit of a nuisance. Here's another way you could do it. You could have your MIDI controller, and then you go to something called a rack mount synthesizer. So this is not a computer; it's a specialized piece of hardware that's designed just to convert this MIDI data into sounds, and you can have a bunch of knobs and settings and stuff. And then go to speakers. And these things are awesome. They're really cool. And this totally works. But rack mount synths are kind of a niche, expensive product. And so I thought it'd be fun to build something like this myself using what I know about microcontrollers. Yeah, I wanted to make something like this for years. I remember thinking about this problem in like high school. Um, and then I went to engineering school, and now I'm a professional engineer. And at work, I saw these STM32 controllers, closed loops at like 20 kilohertz, and I thought, um, that's fast enough for audio. So finally, I have the skill set to do this, but this was way harder than I thought it would be. F4. Here was my plan. I bought this controller. This is a STEM32 F407. So this is the brain chip on it, and it also has a audio generation chip. So this brain chip digitally talks to that audio generation chip, and then the sound goes out of this headphone jack. So the MCU streams audio over a process called I2S. I think that's inter-IC sound. Um, and then there's also I2C commands that like change volume and stuff like that for this DAC. And that goes to the audio jack. Here's another picture of this. So then, but I wanted to mount this STEM32 board on a board that I make with custom knobs. So knobs that control what preset you're playing, the equalizer, the type of waveform, the attack, decay, release, stuff like that. And then just to make this more specific, the interface between the microcontroller and my board is the MIDI interface. So this would come over a MIDI cable. Um, and there's an interesting component called an opto isolator here. I'll talk a little bit about that. Here's a schematic. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, you can take a look. Mostly it's just grabbing the important digital pins from the STEM32 board and connecting knobs, aka potentiometers, to the analog pins. And this interesting circuit is the MIDI optocoupler. So often in audio, you avoid connecting grounds between equipment to avoid ground loops, which cause noise. So you can solve this problem with optics, actually. So this MIDI data can excite an LED inside this little package, and this LED illuminates a phototransistor. So then this phototransistor can pass voltage when this junction is illuminated. And so now your input signal and your circuit of interest, the grounds aren't connected, so that blocks noise from coupling over on the ground lines. So technically, optics are involved in this board, which makes me happy because I'm an optics engineer. So I laid out my PCB. Um, here it is in a 3D render, and here's how it came out. I made this at JLC PCB, which was affordable and great. Now I want to talk about the theory of audio synthesis. How do you actually make music out of math? Let's think about the equation of a musical note. So the note A might sound like sine of 2 pi ft, where f equals 440 hertz, which is a concert A. The main important rule to know about how frequency maps to the notes of the Western scale and the tuning system is that going up an octave doubles frequency. So the A above concert A would be 880 hertz, and so on. Then our current tuning system uses 12 half-step notes in an octave. Adjacent notes are therefore spaced by frequency multiples of 2 to the 1/12th, or the 12th root of 2. If n denotes our distance away from concert A, then the frequency of the note n equals 2 to the n over 12 times 440 hertz. This is called equal temperament, which is when all the notes are spaced equally on a log scale. And that's used 99% of the time today. Historically, there were other ways to do this, and it's a pretty interesting historical topic. I'm going to play the sound of a pure sine wave on my synthesizer. Okay, so you'll probably agree that still sounded like a machine made it. It doesn't quite sound like an organic instrument yet. And so to start thinking about how we can add organic flavors to this sound, I want to pose the question, why does a violin sound different than a piano? I remember being in high school physics and my teacher showed us this sine wave equation and said that's how sound works. Um, and then I asked, but then why can I tell the difference between an A played on the piano and a violin? And my teacher thought about it for a second, and then he said, no, they sound exactly the same. And I was like, that doesn't sound quite right. Um, Today, I know the answer comes down to a couple things. I think the first is the envelope. So we talked about this sine oscillation, which is what makes the note sound like a note. But around it is this wrapper, the envelope. So if I'm a violinist and I play my note, it kind of fades in, right? So you could call this attack. So we ramp up the sine wave with what you can use a linear function, that's fine. Um, and you could ramp it up slow, like a violin, or it could just start immediately. You could ramp it up really fast, like I don't know if you had a glockenspiel. That doesn't fade in, does it? And then the next phase is this decay. Um, if you solve the equation for a damped oscillator, you get an exponential decay. So that's a good idea. Let's use that. So a violinist can actually just keep pumping energy into their string. It doesn't have to decay if the violinist is still pumping the bow. But if you hit a piano, um, you're not pumping energy into the system. It has to decay. And so it decays by this exponential. And then there's a third phase we can call release. So if I release the note of a piano, a felt damper then touches a string and dampens it much more quickly than just like air did. So this is air damping, and then there's very fast felt damping. Or you can imagine release as the sound lingering in the room and decaying as it oscillates a little bit. So with this envelope, we actually have an enormous amount of flexibility to create different sounds. Now I'm going to demo for you that same tune. It's You I Like. First, I'm going to play it on a sine wave with an envelope that kind of sounds like a glass harmonica, and then I'm going to sound it. Then I'm going to play it on a sound that's more like a plucky harp. reason I think a piano and a violin sound different is the overtones, or the harmonics. So consider a string instrument. A length of string can produce several different frequencies. In fact, they are all integer multiples of the fundamental, the longest wavelength. So if I have a string with fixed nodes here, it can oscillate like this, or it can oscillate with a fixed node in the middle, or two fixed nodes. And you can see geometrically how these produce 1F, 2F, 3F, and 4F. And notice the smaller the distance between these nodes, the faster this string is allowed to oscillate. What's interesting though is that all of these overtones can be excited at the same time. So say I pluck a guitar string and I pluck it at this initial white triangle. If I then let that oscillate, I'm actually letting all these harmonics be excited at once. If you map what these harmonics would be to the Western scale, the first 5 harmonics you get C, then C an octave up, then a G, then another C, and then an E, C, G, E. That is a major chord. So in many notes of many instruments, a major chord is embedded. So that might be one reason why the major chord sounds so pleasing to our ears naturally. It sounds right, doesn't it? So to create more interesting sounds, we want to start layering harmonics, layering overtones over our fundamental. So how should we do that with our synth? So we could definitely just keep on adding sine waves on top of each other. That would be a really nice way to make like an organ synthesizer, because that's basically how organs work. But what's traditional in synthesizers is subtractive synthesis. So what you do is you start with a waveform that has too many overtones, and then you use a low-pass filter to clean it up. So our input from our keyboard would excite an oscillator. And so in the analog days, it was easy to make saws and square waves with just a few circuit components, like diodes and things like that. Um, and these squares and sawtooths are actually rich in overtones and can sound quite beautiful. However, they create a infinite overtone series. And some of that high stuff sounds pretty harsh. So it's a good idea to throw that through a low pass filter that cleans up the highest overtones. And then you amplify that and you can listen to it. So let's talk about the sawtooth. So in my eyes, the saw is king because it contains all the harmonics, which makes it popular for emulating strings, brass, and woodwinds. And if you think about the physics of pulling a bow along a string, right? How does that work? You pull the bow and the string is kind of sliding with you, and then it kind of slips backwards. And then it slides with you, and then it slips backwards, and so this kind of slip slide action actually carves out a sawtooth. So it makes sense that saws sound a little bit like strings. If we take the Fourier transform of this sawtooth wave, we get this function. And the main thing I want you to look at is this 1 over k thing and this sine of 2 pi kt. So in English, this is saying that as you go up in harmonics, the kth harmonic is diminished by 1 over k. So the fundamental is strength 1. The third harmonic is strength 1/3. The 10th harmonic is strength 1/10. And that kind of sounds like the higher harmonics go away fast, but we basically hear in logarithmic units. And so if you plot these harmonics in logarithmic units, you can see all of them, right? And our ears are incredibly sensitive, and we can basically hear all these harmonics. If you were to write these harmonics on a musical scale, we start with that major chord that I showed you, becomes like a kind of a dominant 7th situation, and then if you start reading these notes, you get all sorts of crazy notes. And if you were to smack all these notes at the same time together at a piano, it wouldn't sound good. So here's what a pure sawtooth without the low pass is going to sound on that melody. That up, not like that either. So we're going to clean that up with the low pass filter, but first let's think about how do we code this synth engine to create these envelopes and waveforms. So we can write we can now, with our better understanding of musical notes, we can write a new function. Let's call it onv of t times wave of 2 pi ft, where onv of t is a piecewise function that's either linear, a slow exponential decay, or a fast exponential decay. And you could write that out like this. And wave can be any waveform, sine, square, sawtooth, or any function that we can dream up, because and we're implementing this digitally. So if we think of some crazy kooky function for waveform, we can use it. So how would you try to code this? Okay, so my first attempt looks something like this. Um, I used sine of 2 pi ft times exp of minus 2 over tau, where tau is this decaying exponential time constant. So this looks fine, but our controller has to run this at an audio sampling frequency of 48 kilohertz. Um, and if you're trying to do stereo output, something different for the left and right channel, you might have to double that number. And then you might have to do 10x that number if you're playing 10 different notes because you have 10 fingers. So that comes out to a million times a second. So we have 1 microsecond to do the math of computing the audio sample. So will this work? Well, let's think about how a microcontroller actually calculates sine and exp. So CPUs are only really good at arithmetic, like adding and multiplying. When you run sine or exp, the microcontroller is actually using Taylor approximations or something called a Chordic approximation, and that takes tens or hundreds of clock cycles. So the solution is to use a lookup table for sine instead of calculating it by hand, calculating it each time. So instead of indexing sine with a phase from 0 or 2 pi, you have phase go from, for example, 0 to 1024 and look up the number out of a table. For exponential, well, what is an exponent? It's a repeated multiplication by some sub-1 scalar, and that causes something to decay exponentially. So instead of calculating the exp of some time, let's just find the less than 1 scalar that will implement that decay. For example, maybe 0.999. If I multiply the audio sample by 0.999 every time interval, then this will induce some exponential decay. Here's some other arithmetic tricks that I learned. Division also takes like 20 clock cycles because division is not addition or multiplication. You have to turn it into other math to let the CPU solve it. So instead, it's better to multiply by a scalar found in a lookup table. Modulo is also a really important function. This is as slow as division. So instead, you can bit mask. So if I want to do counter modulo 1024, which is 2 to the 10, I can instead just throw away the higher order bits with this operation. This onv of t time, and I promised we would have this low pass filter to clean up our oscillator, right? So we could wrap this onv of t times waveform of 2 pi ft times a low pass filter. So how do you implement this electronically? So here's a simple first order low pass. I learned this like in an Arduino class. So this is what this function is saying is your new filtered output is some combination of the old filtered output plus the new input. You kind of like are giving your estimate over time momentum, right? So if I'm have a temperature sensor and my temperature sensor is saying it's 25 degrees Celsius, 25 degrees Celsius, and then suddenly it gets an input that's like 100 degrees Celsius. It's like, whoa, is that even real or is that garbage? So you might want to take that with a grain of salt and then add that 100 Celsius to your estimation, but with some scalar. So you have this 1 minus alpha scalar that's retaining your old value, and then you have this alpha scalar that is how much you believe your new input. And this is really just a general way to write a moving average. So if you do a moving average like this is only minus 6 dB per octave. And our ears are really sensitive, and this barely sounds like a filter. So we can implement a higher order filter. It's very common to do minus 24 dB per decade. And then I looked up how to implement something like this in C. So here's a fourth order infinite impulse response filter written in direct form 2 transposed. There's a good video from Phil's lab on this that I recommend. So now instead of just this one alpha coefficient, we have this vector of b's and this vector of a's to do our estimate. And how do you get those A's and B's? I use Python to generate, I use this Python signal library to create this Butterworth filter that generated my A and B vectors for a vector of different cutoff frequencies. So then my synthesizer has a knob. My synthesizer has a knob called LPF frequency, and when I turn this knob, it changes the vectors A and B that are used by getting it from this lookup table that I generated in Python, and that dynamically changes the filter that you hear over time. So I'm going to show you what this sounds like. I'm going to play a chord on a sawtooth, and I'm going to change this knob, and you're going to hear this sound get darker and darker over time. And you can watch the Fourier transform and see how it cuts off the highest harmonics and sounds smoother over time. I implemented this cool effect, you could call it wah-wah, where the filter cutoff is mapped to how hard I play and how many notes I play. So this is a very funky, cool effect. So here's some Michael Jackson on that sound.
Now I want to get into some nitty-gritty timing stuff.
Um, because our synthesizer is pulling off the illusion that the computer is multitasking. But CPUs can really only do one thing at a time. The microcontroller has to multitask by listening to what digital notes my keyboard plays, and then it needs to generate all these audio samples without glitching. So I can't have the audio engine like glitch when it has to listen when the microcontroller has to listen to me um, listen for my he played the note C input. Um, so the question is, how can we multitask on a CPU-based machine? So here's kind of the block diagram of everything the CPU is listening. It's listening to MIDI from the keyboard, and it's listening to knobs and buttons on my PCB, my printed circuit board. And then it's constantly streaming audio signals to this DAC. And if any of this audio gets interrupted, it's a very glitchy, scary sound that we don't want. Blocks within the MCU. How do we pull out this illusion of multitasking is twofold. One is peripherals. So peripherals are hardware blocks within the MCU, the microcontroller, that automate specialty tasks. And the other trick is called direct memory access. And this establishes a pipeline from the peripheral to memory, letting peripheral get or set memory without CPU intervention. So this MIDI data streaming from the keyboard actually gets intercepted by this UART peripheral. And this is just a machine that interprets the commands and that listens to these commands and writes them directly in a block of memory. This ADC peripheral does the same thing. It's constantly listening to these button states and then piping it into memory. Then this SPI peripheral, we use direct memory access to constantly stream to a buffer from a buffer of memory right out to this DAC. And the CPU is allowed to think and compute audio samples and get and fetch stuff from memory. The important thing in this is this audio streaming. So I want to talk about this concept called double buffering. And I have a cutesy little animation to show how this works.
The audio samples that we want to send out to the DAC are computed in a location in memory called a circular buffer. So our CPU uses its math based on whatever key presses the user has hit to generate these waveforms and store them in a buffer. And this buffer is constantly being sent out to memory. And rather than use an infinite section of memory, when we hit the end of this buffer, we just start writing back at the beginning. So the CPU is doing the work of this orange arrow. It's trying to run
Double
faster
buffering.
than the audio sampling frequency to fill in the spaces of this buffer. Then this blue arrow is
Double
doing the work
buffering.
of the SPI peripheral, constantly sending that buffer at a steady
Double
rate
buffering.
out to the DAC so that the DAC can convert these elements of memory
Double
into
buffering.
audio waveforms. Whenever this orange arrow is not moving in this animation,
Double
the
buffering.
CPU is free to work on other tasks, such as interpret the MIDI commands, read the
Double
state of the
buffering.
knobs and change sound parameters, or check the states of buttons.
Double buffering.
The timing is coordinated by these speech bubbles, which actually represent something called
Double
interrupts.
buffering.
So, an interrupt is a message that the microcontroller fires used to coordinate
Double
certain
buffering.
tasks, and completion and timings and that sorts of thing. So, this halfway
Double
done
buffering.
boss interrupt indicates that we've streamed out half this buffer. That means
Double
now it's a
buffering.
good time to populate the front of this buffer because you don't want to be populating the buffer with the CPU
Double
while you're
buffering.
streaming it out to the DAC. You want to be writing in a safe section
Double
of
buffering.
memory that's not currently being sent out for audio, right?
Double buffering.
And then when this done interrupt fires, that means the CPU is now
Double
free to
buffering.
write in the second half of this buffer. So these interrupts coordinate the whole timing of our
Double
program.
buffering.
Everything revolves around how often we are emptying this buffer into the SPI peripheral.
That our waveforms, because we're in the digital world, they're not limited to squares, sawtooths, triangles. We can get really creative. So what I did is I used Microsoft Paint to hand draw some waveforms to give some unique characters to my sounds. Some of these are inspired by real instruments. So this E square sound is inspired by my Nord synthesizer. This I looked up piano waveform and I saw a picture that looked like this. I'm like, all right. So I tried to draw this, and same with clarinet and same for cello. And if you look at these pictures, it's fun to guess what harmonics do you think are present in these waveforms? What's next? I sold one of these units to an LA-based keyboard player named Amy Nolte. She's an awesome jazz pianist, jazz singer, music educator. She makes great videos. Um, and we just had a great call where we talked about my synth and I showed her how to use it. And the reason I reached out to her is because she has a video where she demonstrates how fun that little keyboard is for gigging. And she said, I just wish it had a Hammond organ. And so I made a synth that had a Hammond patch on it, and so I mailed it to her. So that was really cool to get a professional to play my instrument, and she might gig with it, which would be awesome. My thing is not USB MIDI compatible. It's actually really hard to do the coding for the USB interface. So maybe I'll do that one day. My next synth, I'm going to use a Daisy Seed, which is a faster MCU with more memory. And I'm going to build a synthesizer with capacitive touch keys and a mouthpiece that you can blow into it. It's going to be like an electronic melodica. I'm going to call it the E-Lotica. So that's on the docket. Hold me to it. Keep me honest. GitHub. I have my code posted on GitHub. It's all in one file because I'm not the best C programmer in the world. So that makes it a little confusing, but easy to copy and paste and modify. Reach out. I'll answer any of your questions. I'll get on a call with you, whatever you want. The synth DIY community when I made this thing. I posted this on Reddit and got a lot of awesome outreach. And I'm inspired by that community and excited to keep being a part of it.